Welcome back to Silent Paws and Brave Hearts. The cabin door hung by a single rusted hinge, swaying in the February wind like a broken promise. Thomas Reid stood in what used to be a doorway, his breath forming clouds in the frozen air. 41 years old, former Navy SEAL, and now the owner of a structure that barely deserved to be called shelter. Behind him, a German shepherd with a graying muzzle and eyes that had seen combat sat perfectly still. The dog's name was Shadow. 6 years old, 70 pounds of loyalty wrapped in black and tan fur. Shadow had been with Thomas through 3 deployments, through firefights and nights when the darkness felt too heavy to survive. The dog had never left his side, unlike his family. Thomas pulled the crumpled deed from his jacket pocket, the paper already soft from being unfolded too many times. His aunt, Patricia Hollis, had smiled when she handed it to him at the lawyer's office 2 weeks ago. That smooth, practiced smile that never reached her eyes. "It's what your parents would have wanted," she'd said, her husband Gerald nodding beside her like a trained dog. "The house, well, it needs so much work, Thomas. We thought we were helping by taking care of it while you were away." Away. 12 years serving his country. 12 years in the teams, carrying wounded brothers through enemy fire, jumping from helicopters into the Black Ocean, learning that SEALs never leave a man behind. But apparently, family could. The house he'd grown up in, the white 2-story with the wraparound porch where his mother used to sit and watch fireflies, was gone. Patricia and Gerald had transferred the deed into their names while he was in Afghanistan. Legal, clean, irreversible. Instead, he got this, a condemned hunting cabin 40 miles into the Wisconsin woods that locals called the Dead Shack, or that rotting place nobody wants. Thomas stepped inside, and the floorboards groaned like dying men. The roof sagged so badly in the center that he could see daylight through the gaps. The windows were just empty frames letting in wind that cut through his coat like blades. There was no furniture except a 3-legged chair lying on its side. The walls had holes large enough to fit his fist through. The smell, wet rot, animal droppings, decades of abandonment, made his eyes water. Shadow followed him in, nails clicking on the warped floor. The dog circled once, then sat down beside Thomas's leg, leaning his weight against him the way he always did when he sensed his human was hurting. Thomas's right shoulder, the one that sat lower than the left from the blast that had ended his career, began to ache. It always did when the weather turned. The doctors had told him he was lucky. The shrapnel could have killed him. Instead, it had just ended everything he was. He sank down onto the filthy floor, his back against the wall, and Shadow immediately pressed against him. Thomas buried his face in the dog's fur, and for the first time since the lawyer's office, he let himself break. "We got nothing, boy," he whispered. "Not a damn thing." Shadow licked his hand once, steady, present, loyal. The kind of loyalty Thomas had believed his family possessed. The first week was survival. Thomas spent his days patching holes with scraps of plywood he scavenged from a collapsed barn 3 miles away. His hands bled from hammering nails into frozen wood. Every swing of the hammer sent pain shooting through his damaged shoulder, but he kept working because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant feeling, and feeling meant drowning. At night, he built small fires in a makeshift pit, feeding them with broken furniture and dead wood. Shadow slept curled against his side, sharing warmth. Sometimes Thomas woke gasping from nightmares, gunfire, screaming, the wet sound of a brother dying in his arms, and Shadow would press his nose into Thomas's neck, breathing steady and calm until the terror passed. The cold was relentless. Wisconsin in February showed no mercy. Thomas had survived worse: desert heat that cooked men in their gear, mountain cold that froze eyelids shut. But this felt different. This wasn't a mission with an end date. This was just existence. He walked into town on the 8th day because he had no food left. The diner sat on Main Street, windows fogged with steam. Thomas pushed through the door, shadow at his heel, and every conversation stopped. Eyes tracked him: the tall man with the hard face and the military dog, the stranger who'd taken up residence in the cabin everyone knew would kill him before spring. Counter or booth? The voice belonged to a woman in her late 50s, steel gray hair pulled back tight, sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. Her name tag read Ruth. "Counter's fine," Thomas said quietly. She poured coffee without asking, set it in front of him with a heavy ceramic mug that radiated warmth into his frozen hands. "You're the one staying at the Wickham place," she said, not a question. "Yes, ma'am." "Folks are saying you won't last till March." Thomas wrapped both hands around the mug. "Folks might be right." Ruth studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she turned and called back to the kitchen. "Charlie, fix a plate, the big breakfast." "I can't," Thomas started. "You can pay or you can work it off washing dishes," Ruth said flatly. "But you're gonna eat. That dog, too, he looks hungry." Thomas's throat tightened. He hadn't expected kindness, didn't know what to do with it. When the food came, eggs, bacon, hash browns, toast, he ate slowly, mechanically. Shadow got a plate of scrambled eggs and bacon on the floor beside him. Ruth refilled his coffee twice without speaking. When he finished, Thomas stood. "I'll wash dishes." "Kitchen's in back," Ruth said, then quieter. "There's a man named Victor Brennan runs the hardware store 2 blocks down. He's always looking for help with deliveries. You need work, he's decent." Thomas nodded, not trusting his voice. He washed dishes for 2 hours while Shadow waited patiently by the back door. When he left, Ruth handed him a paper bag. "Leftover biscuits," she said. "They'll just go to waste." Victor Brennan was 63, tall and lean, with carpenter's hands scarred from decades of work. He hired Thomas on the spot to make deliveries, paid him cash at the end of each day, and never asked questions about the cabin or why Thomas was there. After the first week, Victor showed up at the cabin unannounced, his truck bed loaded with lumber. "Can't have you dying in that death trap. Bad for property values," Victor said gruffly. He helped Thomas reinforce the sagging roof beams, showed him how to properly frame the windows. When they finished, Victor pulled a solid oak door from his truck. "Every man deserves a door that closes," he said. Thomas stood there, hammer in hand, looking at this stranger who had shown him more kindness in 2 weeks than his own blood had in years, and something inside him cracked open. "Why?" he asked, his voice rough. Victor met his eyes. "Because I was you once. Came back from Vietnam to nothing. Someone helped me, now I help you. That's how it works." The blizzard hit on a Thursday night in late February. Thomas had been living in the cabin for 5 weeks. It wasn't much, still cold, still rough, but it was standing. He'd patched every hole, installed the windows Victor had donated, hung the oak door. There was a table now, built from scrap lumber, shelves on the walls, a real bed frame with a mattress Ruth had found at a yard sale. The cabin had become something close to livable. Then the storm came. It started with wind that sounded like screaming, then snow so thick Thomas couldn't see 5 feet beyond the windows. The cabin shook with each gust. The roof groaned. Shadow paced, anxious, his ears flat against his skull.
Thomas kept the fire burning, kept the lamp lit in the window, a habit from the first night, lighting it so he wouldn't feel so alone in the dark. Around midnight, Shadow's head snapped toward the door. A low growl rumbled in his chest. Thomas grabbed his coat and the flashlight, opened the door into the screaming white void. At first, he saw nothing. Then, movement, shapes stumbling through the snow. "Help!" a woman's voice, raw with terror. "Please, my baby!" Thomas didn't think. His SEAL training took over. He ran toward the voice. There were 4 of them. A woman in her early 30s, dark hair plastered to her face with snow. A man, mid-30s, supporting her. A boy, about 7, trembling violently. And in the woman's arms, wrapped in a soaked blanket, a toddler who wasn't moving. "Truck went off the road," the man gasped. "We saw your light." "Inside, now." Thomas grabbed the woman's arm, guided them all back to the cabin. Shadow led the way, breaking trail through the deep snow. Inside, Thomas locked the door against the storm and turned to assess. The toddler, maybe 2 years old, was blue-lipped and unresponsive. Hypothermia, advanced.
Every second of his combat medical training flooded back. Thomas took the child from the mother's shaking hands. "What's his name?" he asked, already moving toward the fire. "Ethan," the woman sobbed. "His name is Ethan. Please." "I've got him," Thomas said, and his voice carried the authority of a man who'd pulled dying teammates from freezing water. "I need you to trust me." He stripped the wet clothes off the tiny body, wrapped Ethan in dry blankets from his bed, held the child against his own chest. Skin to skin, slow warming. Too fast would stop the heart. The mother, her name was Sarah, knelt beside him, crying. Her husband, Michael, held their older son, Daniel, both of them shaking with cold and fear. Shadow lay down beside Sarah, pressing his warm body against her, offering what comfort he could. "Talk to him," Thomas said quietly. "Let him hear your voice." Sarah leaned close, whispering to her son, singing softly, her hands trembling as she touched the child's pale cheek. Minutes passed like hours. The storm raged outside. The cabin held. Then, a breath. Small, shallow, but a breath. Ethan's eyelids fluttered. Sarah made a sound between a sob and a prayer. Thomas kept the child against his chest, kept warming him slowly, carefully, the way he'd been trained, the way he'd saved men who were supposed to die. By dawn, Ethan was sleeping normally. His color returned, his breathing steady. The storm was still howling, but the family was alive. Michael gripped Thomas's hand. "You saved my son." Thomas looked down at the sleeping toddler, then at Shadow, who was curled protectively beside Daniel. He thought about the cabin that was supposed to kill him, the light he'd lit out of loneliness that had guided this family to safety, the betrayal that had brought him here. "The cabin saved him," Thomas said softly. I just kept the light on." The storm lasted 2 days. When it finally cleared, Michael walked to town and called for help. The whole town heard the story, how the Reid man in the dead cabin had saved the Mitchells, how he'd used military training to bring a dying child back from the edge, how his dog had kept the family warm through the longest night. The whispers changed after that. People started calling the cabin the lighthouse. Anonymous gifts appeared on Thomas's porch. Firewood stacked neatly, a bag of potatoes, wire and glass panes, a note that said simply, "Thank you for keeping the light on." Ruth hired him to work mornings at the diner. Victor gave him more hours, better pay. Earl, who ran the feed store, offered him gloves and a winter coat. "Heard what you did. Heard you're one of the good ones," Earl said quietly. Thomas didn't feel good. He felt broken, betrayed, scarred inside and out. But he kept showing up, kept working, kept the light burning in the window every night.
Sarah Mitchell came to visit with Ethan, who was healthy and laughing. She hugged Thomas, crying, thanking him over and over. "You gave me my son back," she whispered. Thomas knelt down, eye level with little Ethan. The boy smiled and reached for Shadow, who licked his hand gently. "You're braver than you know, buddy," Thomas said softly. That night, alone in the cabin with Shadow beside him, Thomas pulled out the deed, the piece of paper that had felt like a curse. He thought about Patricia's smile, the house he'd lost, the family that had abandoned him. And he thought about Ruth's coffee, Victor's door, the Mitchells' lives, the light that had saved them. He didn't have the house he'd grown up in. He'd never get it back. But he had this, a cabin that refused to fall, a dog who refused to leave, a town that had learned to see him not as the broken veteran, but as the man who kept a light burning in the darkness. Thomas folded the deed carefully and set it on the shelf. "We're home, Shadow," he whispered. The dog's tail thumped once against the floor. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft, gentle, covering the scars of the storm. Inside, the fire burned warm. The lamp glowed in the window. And for the first time since he'd come home from war, Thomas Reid felt something he'd thought he'd lost forever. Peace. Spring came slowly to Wisconsin, but it came.
Thomas rebuilt the porch, planted a small garden. Shadow grew gray around the muzzle, but remained strong, faithful, always at his side. The town embraced them. The lighthouse stood. And every night, without fail, Thomas lit the lamp in the window, not for himself anymore, but for whoever might be lost in the darkness, searching for a light to guide them home. Because grace, he learned, doesn't arrive in thunder and miracles. It arrives quiet, stubborn, perfectly timed, in a cabin that refuses to fall, in a dog that refuses to abandon, in strangers who become family, in a light that never goes out. If this story touched your heart, if you believe in second chances and the courage to rebuild when everything falls apart, please subscribe to Silent Paws and Brave Hearts. Hit that like button and share this story with someone who needs to remember that broken things can still serve beautiful purposes. Your support helps us keep the light burning. And remember, you might be someone's lighthouse. Keep your light on.